In military families, service isn't a job. It's scripture. It governs holidays, birthdays, and even dinner table seating arrangements. In the Walsh family, it was gospel passed down in polished boots, disciplined glances, and walls lined with medals. They didn't just serve, they worshipped the code. That morning, the air at Fort Langston was sharp and brittle like something waiting to break. American flags snapped overhead as uniformed officers filled the ceremonial field. The Walsh family stood in formation as if the ceremony wasn't for promotion, but for canonization. Retired General Richard Walsh stood flanked by his wife, Eleanor, a former combat medic who wore formality like armour. Between them was Sabrina Walsh, newly pinned lieutenant colonel. She glowed, not from pride, from perfection. The daughter who fulfilled the legacy. 2 rows behind them sat a woman in a black suit. Not military issue. No insignia, no polished boots. Just presence. Unapologetic. Sharp as glass. She did not belong, at least not in their eyes. Her name was Catherine Elise Walsh. Firstborn. The one they stopped mentioning. Whispers travelled like static. Is that the sister? The one who quit West Point? Didn't she disappear? Why is she even here? And then louder, closer just within earshot, a voice like a dagger wrapped in silk. Some people wear black because they're mourning their own potential. Catherine sat perfectly still. Her hands clasped, her eyes forward. She had learned long ago that silence could be armour too. She looked past the flags, the ranks, the glint of medals. Her presence wasn't an accident. It was a reckoning. Only one person acknowledged her. Aidan Walsh, her cousin sitting several seats away, gave a slight nod. It was enough. It always had been. They had once been inseparable, the quiet twins of a loud family. Same grade, same school, same burden of expectations. But only Catherine had dared to disobey. Only Catherine had vanished. Aidan had stayed. Done what was expected. But even now, even here, he couldn't look away. Sabrina took the stage like a seasoned diplomat. She smiled at the audience, but her eyes flickered not once toward Catherine, but just above her, like she couldn't bear to meet the eyes of a shadow. Some of us are born into duty, Sabrina began, voice rich with conviction. Others choose it, and some abandon it. Gasps were audible, but Sabrina didn't flinch. It takes strength to stay, to commit, to honour the uniform when things get hard. She paused. But not everyone is built for that. The statement sliced the air. General Richard Walsh kept his eyes straight ahead. Eleanor shifted in her seat, lips tightening. Aidan looked at his feet, shame flickering across his face, not for Catherine, but for his silence. Inside, Catherine's voice whispered, "She's not talking to them. She's talking to me. Good. Let her. Let her play the part. Let her deliver her sermon of loyalty and grit. Let the Walsh family cling to their myths." Catherine knew the truth was coming. And it arrived. The crowd parted. A tall figure in full-dress uniform approached. General Hammond, the Chief of Strategic Intelligence. His medals clinked softly as he moved. The kind of man who didn't walk, he cut through space. He did not go to the podium. He walked past Sabrina, past the front row. He stopped, in front of Catherine, and saluted. "Ma'am, General Walsh, it's an honour to see you again." Silence snapped into the air like gunfire. Catherine rose slowly. She returned the salute. "General Hammond," she replied. "Likewise." Mouths opened. No one spoke. Aidan sat frozen, his throat tight. Sabrina's hand trembled around her note cards. Eleanor blinked as if trying to rewrite reality. Richard's fists clenched until his knuckles went white. Hammond moved on, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. The audience remained in suspension, caught between disbelief and awe. In 9 seconds, 2 decades of shame, suspicion, and erasure cracked open. And the woman they called a disgrace had just been saluted as the highest-ranking officer in the room. Not by her family, but by the man who knew who she really was. In the back row, a ripple of something unspoken passed through the officers. They didn't know the full story, but they knew enough respect follows truth. The Walsh narrative had a hole in it now, and Catherine stood calmly in the middle of it. She sat back down. She didn't smile. She didn't need to, because this wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. She had already changed the story, and no one else even knew the first chapter yet. But they would. It was reclamation. She had already changed the story, and no one else even knew the first chapter yet. But they would. Because once, long before salutes and silence defined her, Catherine Elise Walsh was a daughter in a house that knew no language but loyalty. Not loyalty to people. Loyalty to the institution, to ranks, to tradition. The Walsh name wasn't simply known in military circles, it was recited, revered. At Fort Ainsworth, they used to joke that the Walsh children were born with dog tags instead of birth certificates. Richard Walsh, their patriarch, wasn't just a general, he was a symbol. The kind of man who made his own children call him sir at the dinner table until they earned the right to call him dad. His presence commanded quiet. His gaze calibrated behaviour. Eleanor Walsh, a battlefield nurse turned domestic commander, knew how to stop bleeding and emotion with the same efficiency. Their household operated on precision shoes, lined by the door forks at exactly 90 degrees, and laughter permitted only after tasks were complete. Discipline wasn't taught, it was inherited. And in this rigid ecosystem, Sabrina thrived like a well-watered orchid. From an early age, she understood how to weaponize charm obedience and strategic tears. Every certificate she brought home earned her a new frame on the wall. She wasn't merely the younger sibling, she was the curated sequel. Catherine, by contrast, was not built for display. She asked too many questions. She once skipped the cadet choir to read poetry. She was caught drawing over her military maps with imaginary borders, not disrespect, but imagination. And in a house that didn't tolerate deviation, imagination was the first sin. From the outside, it looked like a proud military family with 2 daughters, heading toward greatness. But inside, there was a quiet war. Not of shouting matches, those were forbidden, but of long silences, withdrawn praise and micro-injuries that accumulated like shrapnel. Catherine had once won a national debate championship. The headline in the house that day wasn't her trophy, but the fact that she missed her marksmanship training to attend. Sabrina placed 3rd in a local shooting competition the next week and got her name engraved on the family plaque. Catherine's ache wasn't in the omission, it was in the precision of who was always remembered. Then came the turning point, West Point. Catherine entered first. She was sharp, brave, and far more competent than anyone expected. But during her first year, something changed. There was no expulsion, no failure. But her name vanished from family updates. Richard told their relatives she didn't have the stomach for it. Eleanor stopped sending care packages. Sabrina took over her room. The official version was simple: Catherine quit. In truth, the call came on a rainy October night. Untraceable, classified, the kind of invitation no one gets unless someone very high up believes you can operate in the dark. Catherine didn't hesitate. She left without a goodbye. She was told she could never reveal the mission, not even to family, especially not to family. For the next 2 decades, she became a smoker. Sometimes Aidan, her cousin Sabrina's classmate, the quiet twin in a house of loud legacy, would write, never asking questions, just reporting like a friend with no clearance. Sabrina's a captain now. Your dad gave a lecture at West Point last week. Still got that drawing you made. The one where Ohio borders Narnia. He never told Sabrina, and Catherine never replied. but she read every line. Aidan was never made for combat. He used to sketch dogs during drills. He once told Catherine his dream was to open a shelter for strays not follow orders for medals. "They'd disown me," he whispered once. "They already did that to me," she replied. "So you'd be in good company." But Aidan stayed in uniform, stayed quiet. His was a loyalty born not of belief, but of fear and guilt. After Catherine left, Aidan told no one what he knew. He became the observer, the last thread between a vanished truth and a curated lie. Years later, when Catherine walked into that ceremony in black, the memories flooded back. The porch talk, the shared silences, the way her name had been deleted from the photo above the mantel. Not blurred, not faded, cut, precisely, as if she had never existed. That photo haunted Catherine, more than being called a failure, more than the loneliness of silence. Because that image didn't just deny her story, it replaced it. With perfection, with Sabrina, the child who stayed, the soldier who smiled, the daughter who never questioned. But perfection doesn't invite truth. It erases it. And that day, when General Hammond saluted, the erasure cracked. That house built on medals and myths would soon be forced to remember its missing chapter. And Catherine, no longer a whisper, no longer a regret, was ready to turn the page. But before Reclamation, there had been exile. And before exile, there had been that dinner, the kind of night where every word sounded like a verdict, and silence was just another kind of weapon. It happened 3 days after Catherine left West Point, or rather, after the story of her leaving was delivered to the family like a shameful obituary. She returned home for a single evening, unsure why she came. Maybe it was a habit, maybe hope. The table was set like a military inspection, silver polished cloth, starched every fork, a reminder of discipline. No one stood to greet her. Her chair, always to the right of her father, had been moved. She now sat across from Sabrina, who wore her JROTC uniform, despite it being a weekend. Catherine hadn't even taken off her coat before Richard began. "So," he said, without lifting his eyes from his soup, the cadet walks away. Eleanor stirred her tea with the same rhythm she once used to press gauze into wounds. She didn't look at Catherine either. "I just want to hear it from you," she said flatly. "You didn't even try to finish." Catherine sat stiff back, straight hands folded in her lap. She was already living under orders she could not speak aloud. "It wasn't a matter of trying," she said calmly. "It was a matter of necessity." "Necessity?" Sabrina scoffed. "You always had the luxury to leave. Some of us don't." Catherine turned her gaze to her sister. The words weren't hot. They weren't angry. They were something colder, heavier. Luxury, she thought. No, I had orders no one could ever read. Her lips didn't move, but the words echoed loudly in her chest. Luxury is being allowed to speak, to explain, to be believed. Richard pushed his plate aside. "There's no dishonour in failure," he said. "But there is in quitting," Eleanor added quietly. "At least you didn't drag the name through the mud. You left quietly. We appreciate that." It was a mercy with the tone of a sentence. Catherine looked at her fork, then set it down. She didn't touch her food. Aidan sat at the far end quieter than usual. He kept his eyes on Catherine, not pitying, not proud, just present. When the meal ended, no one rose with her. She stood alone. No handshake, no hug. Sabrina was already texting by the time Catherine reached the door. Aidan followed her out. He didn't say much, just stood beside her on the front porch, hands in pockets. "You okay?" he asked, voice almost a whisper. "That's not the question," she replied. "The question is, will they be?" Aidan glanced back at the window, where silhouettes still sat in their formation. "They're not built to understand things that don't fit in a manual." "Neither was I," Catherine said, "until I learned that you don't need permission to disappear." He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. Even now, even after watching his cousin be dissected at dinner, he couldn't bring himself to challenge the family's narrative. He just walked her to her car and handed her an envelope. "You left this in my room once," he said. It was a sketch, an old one, done on lined notebook paper. A dog wearing medals standing on a battlefield made of chess pieces. "I always liked this," he added. She took it, nodded and got in the car. No final words, no slamming doors. Just one look exchanged between two people who knew how to speak without sound. Catherine drove off into a silence thicker than any reprimand. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply let go. That night wasn't a goodbye. It was a burial, not of her past, but of the version of herself her family needed her to be. And somewhere in the quiet, Aidan stood alone on the porch, watching the taillights fade, knowing he had just witnessed a truth no one else would ever ask about. That truth became Catherine's only companion for the next 20 years. Her name was erased from plaques, her story replaced with polite omission, but beneath borders, beneath silence and shadows, she was saving lives in ways her family could never comprehend, ways that never made the evening news or earned a seat at the dinner table. Her first mission wasn't grand. It involved a failed ceasefire, a humanitarian convoy that never arrived, and a satellite misreading that placed her team 6 miles off course in a terrain boiling with hostility. She carried a boy with shrapnel wounds through a jungle ravaged by chemical spill, her arms numb and lungs burning. She killed for the first time on that mission. Clean. Quick. She didn't flinch until the next morning, when she caught herself whispering the Lord's Prayer to a spoon of dry oats. Later in the debrief, her superior said, "You did well," and that was that. No medals, no flags, just a new assignment. Sometimes her name wasn't even hers. Sometimes she spoke with an accent she'd practiced for months, knowing it would crumble if she slipped on a single vowel. Sometimes she posed as an aid worker, other times as a diplomat's assistant. Once as the mistress of a high-value target, just long enough to plant a transmitter in his wristwatch. In a desert outpost, she negotiated the extraction of a scientist whose work could have triggered global famine. In a collapsed school near Kandahar, she crawled through concrete dust to reach a signal jammer and neutralized it before a drone strike erased 36 innocent lives. She made mistakes. One of them cost the life of her handler, Dev Mishra, a man who once stayed up all night with her reading old Hemingway stories during an embassy lockdown. He died shielding her from a sniper. She wasn't allowed to attend the funeral, but on the anniversary of his death, she poured a bottle of cheap gin into the sand at a rest stop on Route 1 and whispered, "Still Hemingway Dev." The world moved on, but she remembered. She always remembered. Among all the ghosts she gathered, there were moments that held light. In a war-torn border town, she rescued 18 children trapped in a supply depot. The place smelled of rust and fear. The oldest girl, maybe 11, handed her a crumpled drawing 3 stick-figure children holding a bony cat with giant eyes. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, "We save lives in silence too." Catherine folded it carefully. That piece of paper became her one true belonging, crease torn at the corner, ink smudged by the rain. She kept it in her wallet, hidden behind layers of identification that weren't hers. It was a reminder no one would ever clap. But some things didn't need applause. Holidays were the hardest, not because she missed the family table she didn't, but because they served as milestones of absence. Every December she sent one letter. To Aidan. No return address, no message, just a pressed wildflower, always the same Queen Anne's lace. The symbol from their childhood. Back then, they'd collect them during hikes and pretend each cluster was a fallen star. "This one's yours," she'd say, handing him the smallest bloom. "You get the ones that fall quietly." Aidan never responded, not with words, but she knew he kept them. One year, she had intel that led her through DC. She passed by his street, saw the flower pressed between glass in his window. That was all she needed. Her connection to the Walsh family dead, to Sabrina colder than ever. But Aidan remained her lifeline, not for comfort, but for proof that someone still remembered she existed. There were nights Catherine stared at the ceiling of safe houses in Prague, Mumbai, Damascus, unable to sleep, surrounded by nothing but shadows and breath, and she'd picture Aidan reading her silent letter. She knew he'd wonder where she was. She hoped he'd wonder if she was okay. That was enough. The job aged her. Not in looks, but in soul. There were days she forgot the names of the identities she wore, but she never forgot the names of the children, or the soldiers, or the villagers who looked her in the eye after she handed them hope disguised as instructions. And when she stood at that promotion ceremony, years later, facing the family that had buried her story, the drawing from the little girl remained in her jacket pocket. She ran her fingers over the worn paper and thought, some things are worth being forgotten for. She wasn't there for validation. She was there because ghosts deserved to walk through the front door too. Catherine Elise. Walsh had served longer, deeper and more invisibly than anyone in that room. And it had cost her everything except the one truth she carried. Sometimes silence isn't absence. It's a sacrifice. And in her silence, she had built a life between shadows that had saved more lives than anyone would ever know. But shadows have a cost. And even ghosts leave footprints, especially when someone's searching for cracks to exploit. The first hint came through a casual mention. At a secure briefing, a junior officer joked about spooky brass promotions, referencing a general no one ever saw. Catherine felt her stomach twist. She'd spent decades being invisible, but now her absence was being weaponized. What followed was a trail of online posts on closed forums, military circles built on rumour, ego and half-truths. Threads emerged questioning her record. Too clean. No official unit. Operations with redacted partners. They called her the Phantom Star. One user, hiding behind an anonymous burner name, referred to her as a fabricated ghost, a product of military favouritism and classified fiction. At first, she dismissed them. The internet had never been kind to nuance. But then came the references that cut deeper, a mission in Baku, that she led the diplomatic fallout in Ankara she diffused, under an alias, even a name of an operative who died in Berlin, information that wasn't public and shouldn't have been accessible to anyone without clearance. She initiated a trace. Not through command, but through her own channels. She followed metadata like she used to follow enemy signals patiently, deliberately. And what she found burned colder than betrayal, the origin of several posts linked back to a known military device, once registered under Sabrina's internal login. An older credential. Maybe forgotten. Maybe not. Catherine didn't breathe for a full minute. Sabrina. It didn't feel real at first. There had never been closeness, but there had been something. A shared roof. 1,000 passive-aggressive dinners. The kind of sibling rivalry that could have softened with time. But this wasn't a rivalry. It was sabotage. And the most twisted part wasn't the betrayal, it was the reason behind it. Not vengeance, not even anger, just the slow poison of envy. Sabrina had always been seen, always applauded. But the applause, she must have realised, came with a caveat. No matter how perfect she became, there was still someone the family didn't talk about because the silence surrounding Catherine was louder than praise. How do you compete with a ghost whose reputation is defined by mystery and assumed greatness? Sabrina wasn't trying to ruin Catherine's name. She was trying to prove that there was nothing there. That the myth wasn't worth the silence. That her own spotless record wasn't second best to a sister who'd vanished. It wasn't malicious. It was the desperate ache of being measured against absence. And Catherine knew that ache. She'd lived inside it, but she never imagined she'd be the source of it for someone else. She didn't retaliate, didn't report. Instead, she turned to the only person who'd ever stayed human in all of this Aiden. She found him on base, standing beside a simulator, watching a group of young cadets argue over tactics. He looked tired, a little greyer, but his eyes lit up when he saw her, until he saw what she held. "You know," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He nodded. "For how long?" she asked. He swallowed. "Since about a year ago. I tried to believe it wasn't her, but eventually I stopped trying." "You said nothing." "Because I didn't know how to choose." Aiden replied, "She was my tether when everything else fell apart. When I couldn't make the rank. When I froze during that drill. She covered for me, lied to me, got me out of things that would have destroyed my career. She's been my protector. And I was what Catherine asked. Your myth." Aiden looked at her like he wanted to say 100 things, but knew none of them would land. "You were the one who never needed me," he said softly. "You always felt untouchable." That hurt. Deeper than the forums, deeper than the lies, because it came from the only voice that had ever mattered. "You were the only person I ever reached out to," she said. "Every Christmas, every flower. I know," he said, "I kept everyone, and you kept every silence too." She handed him the printouts. "I don't need your defense, but I deserved your voice." Aiden closed his eyes. He looked like a soldier at a firing squad, knowing the shot was deserved. Catherine walked away. Her back didn't stiffen. Her steps didn't quicken. It wasn't rage. It was a resignation. Some betrayals weren't loud. Some were quiet, passive. Some came in the form of not being stood up for. She didn't know what hurt more, Sabrina's calculated jealousy or Aiden's failure to intervene. But she knew this even the strongest ghost needs to be mourned at some point. And Catherine was done being invisible in a family that had used her as both legend and scapegoat. Then came the breach. It started as a blip on an internal server, an anomaly in a high-clearance database storing classified OPI histories. Catherine received the alert through an encrypted channel while reviewing briefing notes for a NATO delegation. The file that had been accessed wasn't just sensitive, it was hers. A record from Operation Sunveil, a mission so classified that its existence had been buried beneath 7 layers of false identifiers. A leak of that magnitude didn't just threaten Catherine's career, it could dismantle decades of shadow diplomacy, expose agents still in the field, and trigger diplomatic fallout across 2 continents. General Hammond's response was immediate. "We contain this in-house," he said, "and we keep it familial." The task force would be made up entirely of the Walsh family. Catherine would lead the investigation. Her father, General Richard Walsh, would manage the physical archives. Eleanor would handle data reconstruction and pattern analysis. Sabrina, of all people, was placed in charge of the cyber trail due to her exemplary record in security infrastructure. Aiden, at Catherine's request, was assigned administrative control, tasked with tracking comms logging access points and serving as a silent observer. From the outside, it looked like a model of unity. Inside, it was a fault line about to rupture. The first briefing was held in a secure room beneath Langston Command. Catherine arrived, first laid out colour-coded files and organised timelines on a digital screen. Richard entered like he still owned every room he walked into. He gave her a stiff nod, the kind you give an officer, not a daughter. Eleanor followed her eyes, unreadable. She carried a tablet already scrolling. Sabrina arrived last late by 3 minutes, hair perfectly tied, mouth set in a line of defiance. Aiden sat near the back notebook, open hands fidgeting with a pen he had never used. "This is bigger than one breach," Catherine began. We're not just cleaning a spill, we're reversing an explosion. She outlined the timeline of access points. Only 6 people had clearance. Of them, only 1 had recently opened a legacy folder. Sabrina. It was a routine integrity check, Sabrina cut in quickly. Protocol 17 requires you to notify the gatekeeper. First, Catherine replied calmly. You didn't. Sabrina's jaw twitched. Are you accusing me? I'm stating facts, Catherine said. Accusation requires motive. Right now, we're still searching for the why. Richard leaned forward. Then stop dancing and ask the question. Catherine turned to the screen, tapped twice, and pulled up a network path. An email from Sabrina's secure inbox dated 6 weeks prior. It had contained a link. The link had led to a document repository. That repository had triggered a dormant script. And that script, embedded more than a decade earlier, had opened the back door to the breach. Aidan's eyes widened. He looked at the printout. That code looks familiar. It should, Catherine said quietly. It was written by Derek Glade. Silence fell like ash. Glade had once been Catherine's analyst on 2 joint missions. He had a temper, a need to be praised, and a growing resentment when Catherine refused to approve a strategic suggestion that would have cost civilian lives. He'd been reassigned shortly after, apparently not quietly enough. The malware had been embedded in a benign update, but it hadn't activated until Sabrina's email unknowingly carried the trigger. You clicked the link, Catherine said to her sister. You authenticated it. You sent it through an unsecured relay. You were the access point. Sabrina stood. This is absurd. I didn't create malware. No, Catherine said. But you carried it. Because you didn't follow protocol. Because you didn't ask. I don't have to ask you, Sabrina snapped. I earned my seat here. Then you should act like you know what it costs to sit in it. The room tensed. Richard glanced at Eleanor, whose eyes never left the code. Aidan scribbled something, then scratched it out. No one moved. Catherine's voice softened. This isn't about blame. This is about containment. But let's not pretend mistakes don't have consequences. For the rest of the week, the family worked like a machine with rusting gears. Richard barked orders. Eleanor analysed packets with surgical precision. Sabrina drowned in silence, rage bubbling just under her skin. And Aidan, quiet, meticulous, Aidan kept recording, kept watching, kept remembering that Catherine had asked for him, chosen him, trusted him. And Sabrina knew it too, which made every moment in that bunker feel like a cage she couldn't escape. The walls were closing in, and no one had even uncovered the worst of it yet. On the 4th night, when the lights flickered low and everyone else had retreated to their quarters, Aidan stayed behind. Catherine sat alone at the long conference table, her fingers brushing across a folder without reading it. Her eyes had stared at too many things for too long. Aidan approached quietly, holding a weathered envelope. He didn't speak, just placed it on the table beside her. She looked at it then, at him. What is this? She asked. A truth, he said. That never made it out of my mouth. Catherine opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter, old creased folded so many times, it looked like it had been carried everywhere and shown to no one. Aidan stood across from her, hands behind his back, shoulders tense like a soldier bracing for judgment. She read it in silence, and the words unspoken for years finally found their place. I watched you disappear from every story we were told. They called you a failure, but I knew better. I walked beside greatness every day and stayed silent. But I saw you. I saw what it cost you to walk away. I saw the strength it took not to explain. You were the only one who didn't need the applause to matter. You taught me that courage isn't about the right uniform, it's about refusing to wear the wrong one. I should have said this years ago. I should have said something when they erased you from the photo, when they said you quit. But I was afraid, and I stayed afraid. I'm sorry for the silence, but it wasn't because I didn't believe in you. It was because I never believed enough in myself." By the time she reached the final line, Catherine's hands trembled, and something unfamiliar pushed forward, hot, sharp, unwelcome. A tear fell onto the page, then another, the first time in 20 years. Aidan didn't move. He just stood there, eyes downcast, letting her hold the moment. "Why now?" she whispered. "Because you shouldn't have to carry the truth alone," he replied. "And because I couldn't be part of the lie anymore." Her voice cracked. "You saw me. Always," he said. "Even when you disappeared, I never stopped watching for you." She closed the letter, held it to her chest and nodded. No thank you, no grand gesture, just the quiet acknowledgement that something had been returned to her, something beyond recognition. It was the soft dignity of being seen without explanation. She stood, walked past him and paused at the door. "They told me being brave meant following the code," she said. "But it was never about medals. It's about choice. You still have that choice, Aidan." He looked at her, something stirring in his eyes, like a tide that had waited years to rise. As she disappeared down the hallway, his hands clenched tighter around the empty envelope. And somewhere deep inside, the first crack in his silence began to give way. Flashback. Summer, years ago, the day before his veterinary school entrance exam. He was packed, ready, hopeful. And then came the order the family had pulled strings. The military application had been processed on his behalf. No questions, no refusal. Richard had said, "You're a Walsh. This is what we do." Eleanor had nodded silently. Sabrina had smiled, called it a patriotic pivot. That night on the porch, he sat with Catherine. She was weeks away from her own disappearance. He told her the truth, that he never wanted this. Those animals made more sense than people, that he couldn't breathe inside the uniform. She had looked at him then, not with pity, not with scorn, but with the same steady gaze she wore even now. Being brave, she'd said, isn't about medals. It's about choice. If they won't give it to you, you have to take it yourself. But he hadn't. He'd followed. And now, all these years later, the echo of her words had finally made it back to him, not as judgment, but as release. But release would have to wait. Because the breach had a name now, and it was crawling back from the past. Catherine hadn't slept in 3 days. She'd rewatched every movement across the digital net, passing through server pings like autopsy reports. The breach was no longer a theory, it was alive, and it had teeth. Every line of code whispered a story she knew too well. The virus embedded in the archive hadn't been opportunistic. It was a trap set long ago, waiting for the right hand to open the wrong door. That hand had been Sabrina's. The trigger, a routine system scan she'd run outside protocol using a legacy login now expired, but once connected to an internal diagnostic system. The malware had been sleeping there for 12 years, waiting for someone with enough access and enough arrogance to skip the rules. Derek Glade had always played the long game. 12 years ago, they had argued in a bunker carved beneath the Adriatic Sea. He was brilliant, precise, and dangerously ideological. He'd pitched a plan to neutralise a warlord's convoy by calling in an aerial strike. Catherine had vetoed it. Too many civilian markers, too much heat. He'd looked her in the eye and said, "This is why you'll never earn a star. You protect ghosts while real people die." She had stared him down, then with the same steady calm she used now. "Better a ghost than a murderer in uniform," she'd replied. She'd won that battle, but apparently not the war. Derek had vanished shortly after that mission reassigned under vague pretenses. What no one knew, what even she hadn't known, was that he'd left her a gift. A worm. A digital mirror. Designed not just to expose classified ops, but to ruin her. The link Sabrina had clicked an efficiency audit, ironically had activated the hidden script. Her impatience had opened a gate not even the Pentagon could have foreseen. The damage was almost surgical. Only missions connected to Catherine were exposed. Only operations bearing her code signature were compromised. It was an execution, not an accident. When she traced the breach to its source, her chest didn't tighten. It numbed. Sabrina's access was undeniable. But what crushed Catherine wasn't the technical failure. It was the casualness of it, the ease with which her sister had ignored protocol, the quiet assumption that she knew better. Those rules were made for people less competent, that her actions couldn't possibly hold consequences. It was hubris disguised as initiative, and now it threatened everything. The family meeting took place in the old secure conference room beneath Fort Langston. Catherine arrived first as always. She wore civilian black, again not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. She didn't need symbols anymore. She was the proof. Sabrina entered last. She looked radiant, as always polished, poised, painfully unaware of the storm she'd summoned. Catherine didn't begin with blame. She began with facts. She laid out the timeline, the metadata, and the logs. She clicked through each image like a courtroom summation, watching as Sabrina's breath grew thinner. You sent an email through an outdated credential. It hit a dormant line embedded years ago by Derek Glade. The malware was keyed to your metadata, Catherine said. You didn't know it, but your recklessness activated it. Sabrina scoffed almost too quickly. That's convenient. Blame me. Again, you've made a career out of being the victim no one can question. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Richard tensed. Aidan flinched. But Catherine stayed ice still. I'm not blaming you, she said. I'm telling you that intent doesn't erase outcome. You didn't sabotage me, but your ego did. Why would I ever want to sabotage you? Sabrina snapped. You weren't even here for 2 decades. Exactly, Catherine replied, her voice suddenly soft. And yet, I never left your mind. She turned to Richard. For the first time, she let her voice fracture, not with weakness, but with weight. You trained soldiers, she said. You built a legacy like it was scripture. And I followed. I gave my name, my life, my voice. I didn't fail. I disappeared for you. The silence in the room cracked open like a vault. Richard's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the floor. I thought you were gone, he muttered. No, Catherine said. You just stopped looking. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly on the table. How much damage is done? She asked. We stopped the leak in time, Catherine answered. But we can't stop the ripple. The questions are coming. The ghosts are waking. Then she did something none of them expected. She pulled out a photo creased, stained, preserved like scripture. The drawing by the child in the war zone. 3 children, a cat, and a single line. We save lives in silence too. She placed it beside the folder marked DG Contingency. This is what I protected, she said. And this, she tapped the folder, is what I endured to do it. She didn't cry, didn't shout, just stood there waiting to see who would look at her and see not a myth, not a mistake, but a mirror. Days later, the mirror was polished for the world to see. The Strategic Operations Forum was held in a windowless chamber beneath Arlington Command, one of those fortified spaces built not just to withstand bombs, but scrutiny. It was where medals were debated before being awarded, where whispers became policy, where people like Catherine had always been referenced but never named, until now. She stood alone behind the podium, flanked by the silver insignia of branches she had served but never belonged to. The room held military brass intelligence chiefs, foreign dignitaries, and more cameras than she'd seen since her mother's last combat medevac was televised. The clearance had come through days earlier. A select number of her operations had been declassified, not for celebration, but for transparency. Hammond had approved it personally with a single sentence. "It's time they know who did the impossible." Catherine didn't wear her uniform to fit in. She wore it to show the world she never left. Her medals were sparse, not from lack of achievement, but classification. Her name tag read simply, Jenna C.E. Walsh. The Walsh part still felt like salt on a wound, but today she bore it with purpose. For 2 decades I walked through corridors built to erase people like me. Not because I was disloyal, but because I followed a different kind of loyalty, one that required silence. She paused. The weight of history leaned in. You don't know my missions because you weren't meant to. You don't know my mistakes because they were buried under necessity. But today, I'm going to tell you one. She recounted a mission in the Horn of Africa, a planned drone strike on a compound linked to an insurgent cell. The coordinates were confirmed. The order was green-lit. But Catherine had paused. I had intel thin but urgent that inside that building were 26 children held as leverage. She looked at the audience. The strike would have wiped out a threat, but it would have also wiped out hope. She had made a call, delayed the strike, launched a ground-op instead risky under-resourced against standing orders. 3 of her team were wounded. 1 didn't make it back, but all 26 children did. The fallout was vicious. Internal inquiry, near discharge, but no one could deny the results. I wasn't brave that day, she said. I was terrified. But I remembered something someone once told me. If they won't give you the right choice, you have to make it yourself. So I did. There was no applause, just breath held tight in hundreds of throats. And then Catherine took a step back. But I'm not the only one whose truth has been buried beneath legacy, she said. Sometimes the people who seem the most composed are carrying their own silence. I'd like to invite someone to speak whose voice, like mine, has too often been filtered through projection. Sabrina. The name wasn't spoken, but the room turned as one when she stood. Her heels clicked like gilt against stone. She looked perfect, as always, hair braided back blouse, pressed medals in place. But something in her eyes had broken. And that crack, for once, let the truth shine through. She didn't look at Catherine when she took the podium. Not yet. She looked at the crowd. And when she spoke, it wasn't with command. It was with surrender. I used to believe perfection was the price of belonging, she said. I lived by the handbook, climbed every rung, checked every box. And for a while, it worked. I was the good daughter, the visible one. But I also became something else, a shadow with a spotlight. She swallowed. I used my sister's silence as a measure, not because I hated her, but because I couldn't compete with a myth. And when she returned, I panicked. I made mistakes. I made choices I regret. And I owe her more than an apology. I owe her the truth. Then finally, she turned to Catherine. You didn't leave us. We left you. A pause. A tear. I'm sorry. The room seemed to tilt. Generals blinked. Analysts whispered. Aidan sat frozen in the 3rd row, gripping a pen like a lifeline. Catherine didn't flinch, didn't blink. She walked slowly to the stage, standing just beside Sabrina, facing her, not the audience. No embrace, no grand gesture, just a long moment of eye contact between sisters who had finally run out of reasons to lie. And then Catherine did something the Walshes had never been known for. She gave mercy without performance. A single, quiet nod. It wasn't acceptance. It was acknowledgement. The kind that meant, I see you. The kind that says we're not the same. But we both made it out. Days later, the Walsh family gathered for something that hadn't happened in over a decade. A dinner. No uniforms, no protocols, no visible medals. Just people and one table set for 5. For the first time since she was 19, Catherine received an invitation with her name handwritten on it. Not from a base commander, not a formal request, just dinner. Sunday, 1900 hours, home. She arrived alone in quiet civilian black. When the door opened, Eleanor was the first to greet her apron, still on eyes flitting nervously from daughter to hallway, like checking for ghosts. "You came," she said. "You called," Catherine replied. It wasn't warm yet, but it was real. Inside, the dining table had changed. Gone were the brass candlesticks and rigid name placements. The tablecloth had wrinkles. The centerpiece was a humble bowl of pine cones and rosemary, but what caught Catherine's eye was the chair. Her chair. At the end of the table, a simple folded card read, Catherine. She hadn't seen her name displayed in that house in over 20 years. Not on walls, not in words, not in memory. For years, she had simply ceased to exist. Dinner was roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and too much wine. Sabrina brought the rolls, store-bought, but arranged on a cloth napkin like they mattered. Aidan had poured drinks with the unsteady hand of someone trying too hard to be neutral. Richard carved the meat silently, methodically, like it was still a mission. Catherine took small bites slower than she used to. She wasn't tasting the food. She was tasting the room. The silence stretched and pulled until finally Aidan set his glass down and said, "This is weird, right?" Everyone looked up. Catherine let out the faintest chuckle. "It's not weird," she said. "It's just new." Sabrina was the next to speak. "I don't know how to sit at a table with you and not feel like I owe you something." Catherine met her eyes. Maybe just the truth. Richard for once didn't interrupt. He leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach, and said quietly, "We were harder on the one who left than the ones who stayed." Catherine turned toward him. "Because the one who left challenged the myth." Eleanor put her fork down. "We built that myth for safety," she whispered. "But it became a cage." Her voice cracked. "I sent you those packages, not to say sorry, but so you'd know we didn't forget you." Catherine looked at her. "I used to stare at them for hours without opening. I'd wonder if they were booby-trapped with guilt." Eleanor laughed, then choked on it. "They were. I just didn't know how else to say 'I love you' with rank breathing down my neck." Aidan, watching the exchange, finally spoke. "I served a system I didn't believe in," he said. "You served a truth I couldn't handle." Catherine turned to him. "I never wanted you to serve like me. I just wanted someone to see why I did." Aidan nodded. "I did. Too late? But I did." Richard stood suddenly and disappeared into the hallway. The family exchanged glances. When he returned, he carried a frame wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly like an offering. It was the family photo, the one that had once hung in the front hall, the one Catherine had been sliced out of. Except, now the photo was restored. A fresh print. All 5 of them standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the old Air Force Base. Catherine, barely 18 in the picture, looked defiant. Hopeful. Free. He placed it at the center of the table. "I kept the original," Richard said, "even the version with the cut. I don't know why." Catherine stared at it, throat tight. "To remember what you erased." "No," he said. "To remember what we lost." After dinner, when the others cleared the plates, Catherine stayed behind with Eleanor. The 2 women sat in soft silence, a candle flickering between them. "You know," Eleanor said, "the day you left West Point, I sat in your room and found your old drawings. Maps, notes, ideas. You were so full of direction." Catherine smiled faintly. "I just didn't know if I was allowed to lead in a direction no one approved." "You were," Eleanor said. "We just weren't ready to follow." The candle sputtered. Catherine reached over and steadied the glass around it. "I don't need you to follow," she said. "Just don't deny I walked." The next morning, the sun peeled back the horizon, like truth pressing against old scars. Langston Base had never looked gentler, its walls bathed in soft light instead of iron grey. Catherine sat on the porch, her coffee cold in her hands, her thoughts even older. On her lap rested a folder she hadn't dared open in years. Commendations, never read aloud. Missions logged under aliases. Lives saved that never knew her name. Across the yard, Aidan approached, not briskly, not nervously, just ready. He sat beside her without a word and set a small velvet box on the table between them. This, he said quietly, was always yours. Even when you didn't wear it. She opened it slowly. Inside, a general's silver star gleamed, new, yet ancient, like it had been waiting for her all this time. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling, not with pride, but disbelief. Where did this come from? She asked. Hammond Aidan said. He said it belonged to someone who chose to disappear for the right reasons, and that someone should be seen finally by someone who knew. Catherine blinked. She thought about the last time she wore a uniform, the day she handed in her ID badge and signed the non-disclosure forms. Her commanding officer had shaken her hand, but never looked her in the eye. History will remember you, he said. But for 20 years it didn't. Now, here was Aidan, hands folded, eyes wet, offering not rank, but recognition. You saw me, she whispered. I tried not to, he said, because if I saw you, I'd have to admit I didn't fight for you. Catherine reached over and touched his hand. You didn't have to. You were the only one who never pretended I was wrong. A silence passed between them, not awkward, not solemn, just full. Across the base, Sabrina entered the hearing room, with a spine straighter than usual, but not rigid. She knew what was coming. The findings were conclusive. While the leak had been unintentional, her deviation from protocol had made it possible. Her request for promotion was officially deferred 5 years. Her file is marked. Her clearance tier adjusted. When the panel asked if she had anything to say, she stood and replied, I understand the consequences. I accept them. But I hope one day my service speaks louder than my silence. She signed the report with steady hands. No defiance, just dignity. That evening, Sabrina came to Catherine's quarters. She didn't knock, just stood by the doorway until Catherine saw her. 5 years, she said, voice low. It'll pass, Catherine replied. But the guilt won't. Sabrina looked down. No, but maybe that's the price of waking up. They sat together, no wine, no ceremony, just 2 sisters with battlefields behind and ahead of them. I used to think you walked away, Sabrina said. Now I know you ran into fire. Alone. Catherine nodded. We all walked into something. Mine just didn't have parades. You were always braver than I, Sabrina said. No, Catherine whispered, just more hidden. The conversation drifted into stillness. Before she left, Sabrina took a ring from her pocket, an old family heirloom passed down from their grandmother once promised to Catherine but never given. Until now. I found this in Mum's jewellery box, she said. It was yours, always. Catherine held it like something fragile. It didn't sparkle, but it glowed. Thank you, she said, for returning something stolen. For what it's worth, Sabrina added. I'm not ready to follow either, but I'll walk beside you. If that's enough? It is, Catherine said. It's everything. That night, Catherine placed the general's star on her nightstand. Not to frame, not to prove, just to rest. Beside it, she left a single note. I didn't need an apology. I just needed someone to say I wasn't wrong. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, not as judgment, but as invitation. That morning, the light came in differently. It wasn't the clinical fluorescence of military halls, or the dim grey of debriefing rooms. It was soft, golden, honest. Catherine stood in front of a full-length mirror she hadn't looked into in 2 decades. The glass was dusty at the corners, the wood chipped the reflection hesitant. She didn't touch it at first, just stood there in silence, holding the one garment that had haunted and protected her in equal measure. Her uniform, folded and stored in a box marked "Do Not Open," now lay across her bed. Time had not faded its colour, but it had deepened its meaning. Every thread carried a memory: the night missions through desert winds, the coded messages sent from war-torn basements, the blood of comrades she couldn't name out loud. Slowly she slid her arms through the sleeves. They still fit, not perfectly, but enough. Like the past was finally willing to embrace her, not smother her. Each button she fastened was a quiet defiance against inertia. She clipped the insignia onto her collar with steady hands, pausing only when she reached the silver star. For a moment, she held it in her palm. The last time she'd seen a star like this was on her father's uniform the day she left West Point. He hadn't looked her in the eye. No one had. Except Aidan. And now, here it was hers. Earned not by compliance, but by conviction. She pinned it on, not as a badge of honour, but as a map back to herself. In the corner of the room sat a small oak desk. On it, a framed photograph newly repaired. Once torn in anger, now taped together with care. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, smiling under a broken roof holding a scrawny stray cat. Dust and light smeared their cheeks, but joy blazed through the grime. Beneath it, faded ink read, "We save lives in silence too." She placed the general's box next to the photo, then added a small brass button once ripped from her first mission jacket, kept in her pocket like a talisman through every operation. And finally, she lit a candle. Not for ritual, but remembrance. A knock at the door. It was Eleanor. No words, just a small, folded American flag in her arms, one Catherine had never seen before. "From someone you saved in Basra," Eleanor said quietly. "She mailed it to headquarters. We kept it. Didn't know what to do with it. Until now." Catherine took the flag. For the first time, her hands trembled. That night she stood alone outside under a sky thick with stars. No ceremony, no anthem, just breath and breeze and memory. Then her voice, soft, steady, cut through the quiet. "You don't need the world to clap for your courage. Sometimes being brave means being silent, until silence becomes the only truth they can't deny." She looked at the camera, one final message for those like her. Have you ever lived misunderstood, erased by your own? Share your story below, because some wars are fought without sound, and some victories don't echo. They exhale. The screen faded to black. The photo remained,